Bom dia a todos. Estamos aqui.
Good morning to all of you. We are here once again.
Desculpe, deu retorno aqui. Bom dia a todos. Estamos aqui por mais uma sessão.
Good morning. Once again, we are here again to proceed to another conference that will address the regulation of platforms. We are going to show you a video and then I'm going to introduce our panelists about international experiences on platforms. Shall we run the video, please? Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I am Marcio Migon. I am the accessor of the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, and currently I'm a coordinator of the CGI.br, which is a multi-stakeholder committee which aims to debate and to centralize a number of guidelines about the development of Internet in Brazil. I'm here today to address Internet and the digital ecosystem, which is the regulation of platforms that has been consolidated in the past decades, and it's driving the economic engine. The big techs or digital platforms have been an issue for several players in the governmental agencies and civil agencies due to its economic and political power and the internet flow that has been achieved. That has been based in data analysis based on democratic processes, subjects' behavior, or maybe the evolution of new ways to develop our work that will lead to the business development in addition to the traditional ability of the society as it is organized based on the public interest. And the debate regarding digital platform regulatory framework, which is being driven by a digital economy, which has reached a market value that has not been yet understood. And the Internet Committee in Brazil has created a group that aims to discuss about the global and national regulatory framework of our digital platforms and to advise upon some issues regarding the transparency of our platforms. We are here to spread that dialogue and to improve our base. Therefore, our forum may reach our goals and to support CGI.br to reach our objectives. This panel is blessed with a number of acknowledged speakers that will address platforms, business models, state of art of our debate, and international experience based on specific tools that may aid us in the regulatory aspect of our platforms. I wish you all a fruitful debate and a great event to all of you. Now I hand over to you, Enrique. Once again, hello everyone. This is our second meeting as part of this set of conferences, which is part of platforms regulatory base, and this is part of our group, which aims to develop some other activities. And our main focus has to do with our regulatory process in our country. Today we have Jeremy West from the OECD and Professor Malavik that had confirmed her participation, but unfortunately her uncle passed away in India and we were just told that she will not be able to make with us here today, unfortunately. But we have Mr. Carlos Affonso from the University of Rio de Janeiro, and he's also representing the Court of Rio de Janeiro, and together with Mr. Jeremy West from OECD and with the moderation of Carlos Affonso. And also we'll be willing to get our participants' questions that can be submitted throughout the question and answer tool or by the chat. Next Thursday on the 27th, we are going to have a panel which will address antitrust tools to allow platforms regulatory aspects. And in the afternoon, at the same day, we'll be able to hear Professor Annabella's talk, who will give us an overview about different issues still regarding the same topic of regulatory aspects regarding platforms, digital platforms. Before I hand over to our moderator, Mr. Affonso, I'd like to say that we have a number of international experts in addition to Mr. West, and our goal is to consider not only the national focus, but also some other guests that are representing some developing countries. So I would kindly ask our participants to address your questions to foster our morning debate. Having said that, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Affonso Souza, who will coordinate our debate from now on. He will introduce our dear international guest, Mr. West. So now I hand over to Mr. Affonso. Thank you. Thank you, Enrique, and thank you so much to CGI for the kind invitation. It's wonderful to be here, to be part of this panel. It's a great honor to be participating here. I will switch to English now, and the translation will continue into Portuguese from now on, so I can address directly to Mr. West.
To English then. To English then.
Então estou mudando agora para o inglês.
Bom, acho que tivemos aqui uma pequena interferência. So, good morning everyone, and good morning Jeremy. It's really good to have you here for this conversation today. What I want to do today is to make sure that we, and thanks Henrique, is just to make sure that we have a conversation today on the issue of intermediary liability, content moderation, and focusing mostly on the issue that Jeremy has been working for quite some time, which is the moderation of terrorist and extremist content on online platforms. So just to make sure everyone at the same page, we are going to provide some overview on how the issue of intermediary liability has been evolving since like mid-90s until today. And the idea is to give you a flavor on how this issue has been changing and how regulators, policymakers are approaching this issue. And especially on the removal of extremist and terrorist content, there will be the focus mostly of Jeremy's presentation. So let me just introduce you, Jeremy. So Jeremy West is a lawyer with experience at OECD, the US Department of Justice, a Washington DC law firm, and the New Zealand Commerce Commission. He leads OECD work on transparency reporting of terrorist and violent extremist content online, which aims to build a framework that any online service provider can use and that all OECD countries will support. Jeremy also co-chairs the Transparency Working Group of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Recently, his work has extended to the role of online platforms as vectors of and defenders against disinformation on COVID-19. Jeremy's book, An Introduction to Online Platforms and Their Role in the Digital Transformation, was published back in 2019. He's a member of the California Bar and the District of Columbia Bar. So thanks, Jeremy, for joining us for this conversation. It's really a pleasure to have you here, and I'm pretty sure our audience, and mostly our Brazilian audience, has much to learn from your presentation. So, Jeremy, feel free to have the floor, and we are eager to learn from you on issues concerning intermediary liability, content moderation, and especially the moderation of terrorist and extremist content. So, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I greatly appreciate that kind introduction, and it's an honor to be here speaking with you and everyone else today. So let me just say a word about the OECD's Digital Economy Policy Division, where I work, and the OECD itself, just in case someone in the audience isn't familiar with the OECD. We are an international organization that provides policy analysis and recommendations to governments around the world on a wide range of economic and social issues, including international trade, taxation, competition policy, internet governance, and a host of other things. We have about 3,000 employees, many of whom are economists, statisticians, and lawyers. And the Digital Economy Policy Division, where I work, is focused on the internet governance piece of things, as well as measuring different aspects of the digital economy. We have units that focus on privacy. We have units that focus on digital security. I'm kind of a free agent that works on whatever the hot topics of the day are. So before I start maybe I can start to share my slides. Let me just do that now. Okay, you should be seeing my cover slide at this point. So maybe before I get into the specific things about terrorist and violent extremist content online, it might be useful to draw the big picture of kind of the arc of policy making over the past 20 or 25 years in this area around the world. It has, since the 1990s, the mid-1990s, policy towards online platforms around the world has tended to be hands-off. There is a variety of legislation in force in various jurisdictions that basically serves to shield platforms from liability for any illegal content that users post on those platforms. There are certain exceptions, and those are starting to become more common. For a long time, they were really not, or the only thing that was an exception was copyright violations. Now there's a bit more, but the philosophy behind this immunity, this liability shield, back in the mid-90s was that platforms were a nascent kind of business. They needed help. And the thinking was that businesses would be afraid to start an online platform business if they were exposed to liability for things that their users posted. So they said, look, we're just a neutral platform. We're like the phone company or somebody like that. We just carry these messages. We're not a publisher, and therefore we shouldn't be liable. And for many years, that was a persuasive and winning argument. But after a while, it kind of started to lose force because many of the platforms had grown so large and so valuable that it was impossible to say that they were weak or needed this extra protection somehow in order for them to grow, because they had already grown to very, very large sizes. And then unforeseen things started to happen. It turned out that there was evidence of people starting to become radicalized online through social media platforms or video sharing platforms. And suspicions started to be raised that the recommendation algorithms that are behind a lot of what these platforms show to their users were themselves responsible. They were driving users into more and more extreme content areas. And in other cases, they were dividing societies or polarizing societies by continuing to show people that the types of stories or news that the algorithm thought they wanted to see, instead of showing them a wider variety and exposing them to other viewpoints. And there were other types of harm that started to become more apparent as well. I won't go into all that, but it's just to kind of set the stage and say that attitudes have started. You can almost feel the shift in attitudes among policymakers that once had a very hands-off attitude toward the platforms and are now rethinking that and considering ways in which they might take action. But to their credit, they recognize that anything they do may have unintended consequences, particularly where human rights are concerned and freedom of expression. So for the most part, they're proceeding very carefully. So with that very basic introduction in mind, let me turn to my first substantive slide, which is just intended to kind of load
Aquí solo quiero ubicar aquí mis comentarios en esta serie de conferencias que está patrocinando la Comisión Brasileña. Yo voy a hablar sobre un tema muy específico. Es un tema urgente e involucra algunas ideas que se aplican a otras áreas digitales de política pública. Y esta serie es sobre regulación de plataformas. Y este panel es sobre marcos reguladores y experiencias internacionales. Yo me voy a enfocar en regulaciones emergentes que enfrentan un cierto tipo de contenido dañoso en línea. Es especialmente peligroso y a veces un daño sensacionalista. Y por eso ha causado o ha generado mucho interés por parte de los formuladores de políticas públicas para emitir nuevas reglamentaciones. Dentro de esas nuevas reglamentaciones que están surgiendo, hay requisitos de que las plataformas en línea, aquellas que comparten contenido principalmente, deben empezar a hacer reportes periódicos de transparencia sobre sus políticas y procedimientos para lidiar con contenido dañoso que surge en su circuito, principalmente el contenido sobre terrorismo y extremismo violento, o como se dice también, Tevec. Aquí voy a hablar un poco sobre lo que motivó estas regulaciones emergentes sobre transparencia. El terrorismo y el extremismo violento no son un fenómeno nuevo. Lo que sí es relativamente nuevo, sin embargo, es que los terroristas y los extremistas se han vuelto muy habilidosos en el uso de Internet para propagar sus mensajes y para reclutar y radicalizar miembros y para organizar y realizar, ejecutar actividades criminales. Y otros grupos están usando el Internet para realizar actividades legítimas y legales. Probablemente un evento que ocurrió en 2019, cuando un terrorista australiano publicó el asesinato de 21 personas en la iglesia Christchurch, en la ciudad de Hale. Cuando digo live stream, yo quiero decir que él transmitió en vivo el acto por el internet. Pero eso no fue el único ataque que se transmitió en vivo. En 2020 también hubo otra transmisión de un ataque y de asesinatos en una sinagoga en Holanda. Es lo que podemos ver aquí en la parte superior izquierda. Y hubo muchos otros ataques terroristas y de extremistas violentos que estaban conectados a plataformas en línea, de una forma u otra. Y eso resultó en una resolución internacional conocida como el Christchurch para eliminar el contenido extremista y terrorista en línea. Y después en la reunión del G7 y del G20, ellos también emitieron declaraciones como llamado a la acción contra esas acciones, y todos enfatizaron la necesidad de más y mejor transparencia de los proveedores de servicios online sobre sus acciones para inhibir ese tipo de contenido en línea. Pero estas declaraciones no evitaron el contenido sobre terrorismo y extremismo violento. En Francia, por ejemplo, la decapitación de un profesor de escuela se organizó a través de medios sociales. También fue un ataque terrorista en Viena que también se propagó en línea. Los videos inundaron el internet después del ataque durante horas y días. Y también la insurrección en el Capitolio en Estados Unidos, en Washington, en enero también se planeó y se glorificó en línea como una herramienta de reclutamiento de grupos extremistas. Entonces el problema de Tevec es que son muy propagados, y estas llamadas a la acción internacionales y para evitar estas tragedias provocadas por Tevec. Y hoy están emergiendo muchas reglamentaciones y proyectos para hacer un llamado a la acción con la actividad voluntaria. Lo primero que hicimos en este proyecto fue verificar el estado actual de los informes de transparencia en la industria. Sobre Tevec, nosotros analizamos las políticas en práctica, principalmente de las 15 principales agencias que comparten contenido. Y ellos sí tienen políticas contra la publicación de Tevec, pero desde el verano de 2020 solo se publicaron 5. Solo 5 de esas empresas, de hecho, publicaron reportes de transparencia específicos sobre ese tipo de contenido sobre terrorismo y extremismo violento. Y todos esos informes no tenían informes específicos sobre Tevec. Era sobre otro contenido. También descubrimos
platforms that did issue transparency reports on Tevec, they were all reporting in different ways. So they used different metrics. They use different definitions of terrorism and violent extremism and what terrorist content and violent extremist content are. And they reported with different frequencies. So together, these two problems of a lack of transparency reporting in general, and then a lack of comparability of the information in the reports that were being issued, basically made it impossible to get a cross-industry perspective on what was going on. It was impossible to tell basically how the industry was doing in fighting Tevec, what was working, what wasn't working so well, and just as important, what the impact on human rights was. So if we fast forward today, I do have some good news, which is this summer, or Northern Hemisphere summer, July or August, we will issue the second edition of this report that brings everything up to date. And the number of top 50 platforms that issue Tevec-specific transparency reports has now jumped from 5 to 11. So that's progress, and the industry deserves some credit for that. It's a big jump in a short time. The new reports are fairly basic for the most part. There is room for improvement there, and they're still all different from each other. But it's a first step. So our research at the same time also showed us something on the government side of the equation, and that is that the emerging regulations that will require platforms to issue transparency reports on Tevec are also uncoordinated, which isn't terribly surprising because this happens in quite a few different contexts, this problem of regulatory fragmentation. So this slide in italics and in white print shows all of the different regulations that are under consideration but not enacted yet in OECD jurisdictions that would require transparency reporting or potentially require transparency reporting on Tevec. And you know, it's the same sort of situation. They would require reporting on different metrics, using different timelines, and in some cases using different definitions. What that means is it's rather likely that in the near future, meaning within a year or two, the platforms, the content sharing platforms, will go from a rather comfortable world in which they weren't required to issue transparency reports at all, but they could if they wanted to suddenly not only having to issue transparency reports, but having to issue multiple versions of those transparency reports every single reporting period in order to satisfy all of the different types of legislation that are coming down the pipeline. And making matters worse, countries would be replicating the cost of developing and updating the reporting requirements in these laws, setting up report filing infrastructures, managing all these filings again and again across all of the countries that are about to enact this type of legislation or regulation. So to sum up, the problems are there's not enough transparency reporting on Tevec at the present time. What there is not comparable from service to service. On the regulatory side, there's a risk of fragmentation and the greater compliance burden that would cause for firms. And there's this problem of duplication or really multiplication of public costs to maintain these types of separate regulations that all would require transparency. So at the OECD, we kind of looked at the horizon and saw this regulatory wave forming. And we asked ourselves, how can we solve all of these problems? And what we came up with was an idea. And, you know, the OECD is not a business. We're an international organization. We're not out there to make a profit. but our idea is inspired by a business model that has proven itself to be extremely successful over the past 20 years or so. So in brief, the idea is that the OECD itself would become an online platform that's multi-sided, meaning that it would serve multiple sets of interrelated users all at the same time, and with all of the very powerful efficiencies and network effects that this type of model typically brings. So we will provide a central service that facilitates interactions between governments, businesses, and the public when it comes to transparency and transparency reporting. To do this, we are developing a transparency reporting framework for Tevec that's based on an international consensus informed by a quite deep multi-stakeholder consultation with experts from the tech sector, from governments, from academia, and from civil society. The framework will include a standardized template of questions that companies would answer to do their transparency reporting. And the idea, as Carlos said in the beginning, is that any company, regardless of its size or its experience, would be able to use this template. And ideally, every OECD country, and hopefully eventually more, will accept this template. Then, by providing a web portal where the standardized template can be accessed and completed and filed, the OECD would become a very convenient, centralized hub or a one-stop shop where companies can submit a single Tevec transparency report that satisfies many different countries all at the same time. The web portal will also provide a convenient service to the governments and the public because the completed transparency reports would go into a database that the OECD would maintain and make secure. The reports would be there for anyone to access, anyone from the public, any government, and use it, visualize it, see not just the individual completed reports, but aggregated data from those reports that the OECD software would help them to build. So let me take a moment and just say that we recognize, we really do, we recognize that this is not an easy area for companies to address for a number of reasons. First of all, there's just a lot of Tevec, even on small platforms. This table compares a micro platform called Just Paste It that only has 5 million active users with Facebook that has about 2.7 billion users. So in the Facebook column, you can see that they had about 18 million pieces of terrorist content in the second half of 2020 that showed up on their platform. That comes down to about 100,000 pieces of terrorist content per day. Given the number of employees Facebook has, that's 1.7 pieces of Tevec per day. But remember, the vast majority of those employees are not dealing with content moderation. This, 18.3 million pieces of terrorist content is a lot of content, and that's just terrorist content. That doesn't include violent extremist content or any of the other kind of harmful content that shows up. But then, if you look at the situation for Just Paste It, that's a platform that has one employee. This guy does everything. Every job is his for this platform. So he's the one who has to deal with Tevec and everything else. And for him, it's 5 pieces of terrorist content per day, which is a pretty big distraction when you're responsible for the whole thing. So we are intentionally designing this framework to make sure that even the platforms like Just Paste It should be able to use it without having an overly burdensome experience. The second problem, and I won't go into all of these, is we know that all of the detection methods that they use for finding Tevec have pros and cons. There just isn't any perfect way to do this. So let me take two of these, which are the top center and top right examples, the internal methods that platforms use to find Tevec. So you can have human beings doing this, which have the advantage of, if they are well trained, being very accurate. However, they're very expensive and they're relatively slow. So you could never find all of the Tevec, especially on a large platform, unless you just had an army of people doing this. That's why a lot of platforms tend to use either a blend or even just exclusively automated detection methods as well. Those have the advantage of being very fast and having almost no marginal cost. But on the other hand, they're subject to biases. They can be over or under inclusive. The voluntary transparency reporting framework doesn't make judgments about how companies are doing in terms of detecting Tevec, and it doesn't tell them what methods they should use. It's simply about bringing key information out into the open in a more standardized and therefore comparable way, so that researchers and policymakers and even the companies themselves can learn from it and determine what's working well and what isn't. So the third and last problem is that moderating harmful content, especially Tevec, requires the companies to navigate their way through some very difficult areas. Human rights is one of them. You have to make sure that you aren't being so zealous in detecting and removing Tevec that you actually go overboard and wind up removing perfectly fine legal speech and therefore infringing on freedom of expression. And there are similar dangers with the right to privacy that they have to worry about. Presumption of innocence, freedom from discrimination. Then there are the tricky issues about legitimate uses or exceptions. Sometimes something that looks a lot like Tevec isn't actually Tevec. It's just a journalist telling a story about something that happened, reporting on Tevec, getting the world informed that a terrorist attack happened, but not trying to glorify it, at least not intentionally. And then there are uses for educational purposes and research purposes. And then there are also other difficult issues that have to do with governments making perfectly legal requests to remove content, but they're still not necessarily legitimate. Because if it's a certain kind of government, they may abuse their authority to discriminate against their political opponents, for example, or minority groups. And then there are other people that pretend that they're governments and that their request has the force of law, but they're actually just some individual hoping to fool the platform into taking some content down. All this is to say that Tevec moderation is basically the wild frontier of digital economy policy, where neither companies nor governments are really sure yet what the right thing to do is. The best practices are not really known yet, but there's a lot at stake. And every time that there's another major terrorist or violent extremist incident that's connected to online platforms in some way, there is tremendous pressure on politicians to do something about it and do it quickly. That is not really the OECD's style, though, taking kind of knee-jerk policy measures in reaction to something that just happened. We favor a more deliberate, evidence-based approach. But in order to take that approach, you have to have a good evidence base in the first place. And that's what's been missing so far in the area of Tevec. And that's a big reason why we undertook this project. So just a few words about the future of what we're doing here. Like most online platforms, the VTRF will benefit from network effects, meaning that the more countries that join this consensus, the more attractive using this framework will be for companies. At the same time, the more companies that start to use it, the more attractive it will be for governments to sign on and use it as well. And of course, the more both of those, countries and companies alike, the more both of those use it, the more helpful this framework will be to the public. At the same time as those network effects become stronger, there will be economies of scale as well. This has to do with online platforms' ability to scale without mass, meaning they can grow and grow and grow without necessarily having to add a new plant or a factory. It's not like that. You just need, computer power for the most part, which means the VTRF will be able to grow and handle more growth in years ahead relatively easily from all three sets of users. Another benefit is that the framework has the potential to grow in scope beyond just Tevec and to encompass other areas where transparency reporting is needed, and a neutral and trusted hub would be an efficient solution. So one example would be child sexual abuse material. And by the way, the volume of that swamps Tevec. It's so sad, but I mean, they're both awful, but there's just an unbelievable amount of this kind of content out there. So it is a huge problem. Mis and disinformation is another type of harmful content that governments are starting to think about requiring transparency on. Same with spam and bullying and hate speech. And probably more things. I've already had conversations with some politicians, believe it or not, about other types of harmful content like fraudulent advertising online and more. So adding these new reporting areas will eventually allow companies to take care of all their transparency reporting requirements through the VTRF hub, while giving governments and the public a single centralized place to access the information in those reports. Lastly, I should emphasize that we're not there yet. Right? This is all just a vision at this point. It's aspirational. We have to prove the concept first in the context of Tevec, and once we do, then the intention is to branch out to these other reporting areas. So I'm going to stop there. I've done a lot of talking, and I want to thank all of you for your kind attention.
So thank you, Jeremy, for this very, very insightful presentation. It's really interesting to understand this bigger picture of transparency requirements for Tevec, and how OECD is seeing itself as a hub for this enlarging of the conversation that could include other topics as well. I will go back to that point in just a minute. We have some questions from the audience, and we have one question here that I think you have addressed, but it will be important to hear that from you. Our friends from IT for Change, they have sent us a question asking, would platforms be required to report Tevec only for OECD jurisdictions or globally? So how this could be handled? I think that will be our first question. And then I will ask you something else in the light of your very, very last slide. When you address this enlargement of the Tevec framework to other types of contents, the one thing that I tend to be really cautious is the differences between those different contents, and understanding that hate speech, disinformation, misinformation, and terrorist and violent content, they all have different characteristics. They all have different methods on how people engage with them, how they impact the reality outside of our online presence. Does the framework takes into account those different characteristics, peculiarities of those other subject matters? Or by the time we're only focusing on Tevec and this mentioning of other topics, this is just exploratory at this point? So I would love to hear from you on those two topics, just for us to begin with. And then again, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. It will be lovely to hear more from you.
Super, thank you, Carlos. Okay, so the first question was, would platforms be required to report Tevec only for OECD jurisdictions or globally? The answer to that is both, really. The way the companies that issue transparency reports now do it is they tend to report globally. We certainly wouldn't be looking for information that would be limited only to the OECD, but rather the questionnaire or the template in the framework would ask companies for the global figures. However, it may also ask for regional or even national breakdowns of information. I don't want to get into the weeds too much, meaning I don't want to get too detailed. There's certain kinds of information that are basically impossible for the platforms to break down on a regional basis just because of the way the internet works. You can't always tell reliably where a user is coming from. And that can affect the statistics that they're able to report on. But the framework will eventually have several layers or tiers of reporting that include kind of a baseline level or a standard level of reporting that has mostly fairly simple questions. And then eventually there will be higher tiers to recognize reporting that goes above and beyond the standard level, where more detailed information may be asked. And that's where you might start to see questions that ask for a regional or national breakdown for some of the figures. So that's the answer to the first question. On the second question, which was about the expansion of the framework's scope and recognizing the difference in characteristics and effects of different kinds of harmful content, which is certainly true and a fair point. The question was whether the framework would take that into account. And the answer is absolutely, no question about it. It's not like there's going to be one master reporting framework with kind of global catch-all questions that are intended to encompass every type of harmful content. Instead, there will probably be a questionnaire with different sections in it each section of which will cover a different kind of harm. So the OECD will go through a whole new consultation with an expert group every time we consider expanding the VTRF into a new area. So right now we have a group of Tevec experts that are working on this and recommending a final framework to the OECD to approve. If the decision is made to go into CSAM, for example, or bullying, we'll convene a totally different set of experts to advise us on the right types of questions to ask.
Thank you, Jeremy. We are receiving a number of very interesting questions from the audience. So I'll keep on asking them in pairs, just to make sure that we give time for people to send more questions, and at the same time trying to provide some conversation in between the questioning. So we have a question from José Antônio Gouveia Galhardo saying, in Brazil, a significant part of the Tevec content shift to WhatsApp platform, which content is protected by encryption. Do you think your solution will work in messaging platforms like this? So the interaction of the framework and end-to-end encrypted platforms. That's our first question. And the second one, slightly more broad, comes from Gilson Schwartz. And Gilson asks if there is any relation to the model that we're thinking right now, to the way in which cryptocurrency end up working. And I take the interaction of cryptocurrencies as a way to maybe support or finance activities that might be illegal by the end of the day, especially focusing on terrorism and extremist content activities that we are discussing right now. So first question on end-to-end encryption, and second one on cryptocurrencies, if there is any view on how the framework could interact with those topics.
Okay, thanks again. On the first question, which is about Tevec content shifting towards WhatsApp in Brazil, and WhatsApp being an end-to-end encrypted platform, will transparency reporting work to counter Tevec in that area? No, it won't. And because the whole point of end-to-end encryption is that even the platform itself isn't able to access what users are posting. So that's why end-to-end encryption is such a hotly debated topic right now. And law enforcement and intelligence services are so worried about it. But at the same time, privacy advocates are very much in favor of it. But when it comes to Tevec, the service is not going to be able to report because they just don't have the information. They don't know. By design, they don't know. So there, other solutions are going to have to be, even where Tevec can be reported in a transparency report, it's not like transparency was ever going to be the magic bullet. Nothing by itself can solve this problem. In fact, even multiple solutions probably are never going to completely solve this problem. It's just too pernicious. It's too difficult. But governments and civil society groups are taking a multitude of approaches to try to address the Tevec problem, including using things like counter narratives, where if someone goes onto a platform and starts to search for known terrorist content, the recommendation engine automatically redirects them towards material that is designed to de-radicalize them instead of encouraging them to continue doing the same thing. Now, the second question was, what about any relationship to cryptocurrency? And might things like Bitcoin wind up financing terrorist activities? Sure, it could. Right now, I don't know of anybody who is thinking about asking transparency type questions about cryptocurrency, but you could imagine that politicians may start to ask those kinds of questions, especially if for some reason evidence starts to emerge that terrorists are getting a lot of their financing through cryptocurrencies. At first, I thought this question was going in a different direction, which was, do you think you could use blockchain technology to improve the VTRF somehow? That's also really
explore this direction as well. Quite interesting.
Yeah, I had not thought of that, but its advantages for like security and ensuring that people are who they say they are could be really important, because one of the difficult challenges that we're facing is, if we set up this hub, how can we make sure that the people who come online to fill out a transparency report actually work for the company that they say they work for? It would be, I'm sure, a wonderful opportunity for bad actors to go and fill out a completely bogus transparency report and attribute that to YouTube or Twitter or somebody like that. So we have to work problems out like that, and it's possible that blockchain could help us do that.
And that's super interesting, because if you think about, especially going way beyond the bigger platforms, the issue of knowing who is reporting, it will be extremely important, because you might not know any contacts or known about this platform at all. So that will be definitely something interesting to explore. We have another question from the audience, from Gilson Fais, who's pretty much concerned on how does a whole initiative to tackle terrorism and extremist activities, how can we come to a conclusion that this will not result in censorship and that will not create incentives for platforms to end up restricting speech, curbing or in some way restricting the way in which people communicate through platforms. So we would love to hear on this balance on tackling this type of illegal activities, but making sure that you do not end up sending out the wrong messages and creating incentives for censorship. That's one question. And I would like to go back to one of your slides when you were mentioning ways to flag and to identify Tevec. And you mentioned, of course, automatized reviewing using AI and methods that will make sure that moderation happens, especially at scale. We know that AI systems for content moderation are still far from ideal, but they have been pretty much mentioned in every single conversation that we had, especially if we look at the previous hearings that we had with big companies in the US Congress. I recall, for instance, one of the executives from one of the major internet platforms saying that his view for changing Section 230 in the US would be to make sure that bigger platforms end up being able to provide evidence that the AI methods for them to flag content, to identify content, that those methods are being applied in an efficient way. So to make sure that we can go back and understand how those AI systems are being applied and how efficient they are being in tackling content such as Tevec. So I would love to hear from you about how do you see the status of automatized moderation of Tevec? How do you see the current state of the art, especially on bigger platforms? And if you see any chance of, if it's even advisable, to insert some kind of check on the efficiency, on the way in which platforms are applying those methods of moderation into some form of either regulation or soft law or co-regulation approach. So 2 questions, one on human rights and censorship, on fighting Tevec, and the other one on automatized content moderation. And sorry for the long questions.
No, not at all. It's very helpful to have a full explanation of what you're after so that I can answer properly. Okay, so on the censorship question, the question is, how can we be sure that we're not inadvertently encouraging platforms to censor, to go overboard? If you ask them to report how much Tevec did you remove in the last 6 months, and then either we or probably third parties are going to compare that number to how much content they removed in the previous 6 months and so on, and look at trends. There may be a subtle message that gets sent that is not intended to be sent, that somehow more is better, that the companies are expected to show a trend over time, that, well, we removed 6,000 pieces in the first half of the year, but in the second half we removed 8,000, so we're doing better. That is absolutely not what we should be sending, because the fact is it's indeterminate. It's not necessarily better or worse. It's just information that has to be examined in a much broader context of what's going on. So the way we are handling this is, first of all, our experts group is very, very diverse, and it includes people who have devoted their whole careers to protecting freedom of expression and other kinds of human rights. So their voices are very much part of the whole advisory body, and they help the group to phrase the questions in ways that are as neutral as possible. We also may have in the instructions section of the template or somewhere else in the framework, information about interpretation of the results and cautioning people that they shouldn't necessarily assume things like greater content removal means the platform is doing a better job. It might, but it might not. And we could go into all the reasons why that's the case. Facebook already does this in the transparency reports that it issues, and it does a really good job of it. So if you've ever read one of their transparency reports, and I recommend them, they're not like 100 pages long or anything. They're pretty accessible. They do a really good job of explaining how to interpret the results and what not to do. At the same time, a major purpose of transparency reporting is to ensure that human rights are being looked after properly. So the template will ask questions like, how many, is it possible, first of all, to appeal your content removal decisions? And if it is possible, how many times was one of your removal decisions appealed? And of that number, how many appeals were granted? In other words, what was your error rate? What did you decide your error rate was? And those kinds of statistics can be very helpful if you're trying to get at questions of censorship or protection of freedom of speech. And we may, this is, I tell people, we're kind of in a very primitive era right now. I kind of feel like a caveman who's learning how to use fire for the first time. This is, like I said before, this is the wild frontier of digital economy policy. Best practices aren't clear. We're learning as we go. And whatever we come up with in the first version of the VTRF is probably going to change. It's not going to be written on a stone tablet. The VTRF will evolve. There'll be a 2.0 version, and eventually there'll be a 3.0, and it will become better and better as we learn how to do it and do it well. Now, on detection methods, that's a really interesting question, because it's so timely. It turns out that COVID is responsible for even more of a shift towards automated content moderation. And the reason is that the platforms, especially the big ones, were not able, for reasons I won't go into, they were not able to rely on human moderators to the same extent during COVID as they were previously. And so there is a lot more decision-making going on that's, at least in the first instance, being done by machines, not by humans. Unfortunately, at the same time, COVID has also led to a decrease in the capacity of the firms to handle appeals. So unfortunately, some of them are not allowing appeals on decisions about content moderation. This is supposed to be temporary, but it's gone on for a while, and I couldn't tell you how much longer it's going to last. Do I think that maybe there should be some kind of oversight of this, some kind of check to make sure that automated moderation is working the way it's supposed to work? Well, I know that some policymakers are thinking about that. They may eventually want some transparency reporting on the artificial intelligence that drives these content moderation decisions, and even in some cases on the AI that's driving search engines and recommendation engines. And this is really tricky because you're getting right into the heart of what differentiates one company's business and all of their advantages from another. So the companies are going to be very reluctant to disclose that kind of information. But the discussions are starting to come up. You also mentioned soft law versus regulation, which is interesting to me, just because a couple of years ago, the OECD issued its AI principles, which certainly are soft law, but they've been rather widely adopted and viewed as helpful. So as principles, they're high level, they're kind of aspirational. These are the objectives we want. We want AI to be human-centered and cause no harm and things like that. I mean, there's more to it than that, but it's a start. I would have to think more about whether the soft law approach is where governments are likely to stay. I really don't know. I mean, the OECD itself has no regulatory power. We can't make anybody do anything. It's all soft law. So the voluntary transparency reporting framework, the very first word is voluntary. Nobody has to use it. If a company decides they don't want to do this, or it's too expensive, or it's a pain, they can say no. But it is possible as we go forward, if this approach that we've taken starts to look like the right one to governments, they may issue regulations that ask companies to use the VTRF to do their transparency reporting. But that would be them, not us.
I see. Thanks for that, Jeremy. In thinking about the AI principles from OECD, Brazil has eagerly adopted as well, and that served as a huge inspiration for the Brazilian national strategy on AI as well. It's mentioned a number of times in our own strategy, and I think that's a good example of what we are discussing right now. I have 2 extra questions. And then a final one. So 2 questions for this almost last round. So one comes from Alexandre, and it's focusing on taxation of internet platforms. I understand that we're addressing here mostly Tevec, but feel free to answer as much as you can on the areas that you have been working on OECD. So the question goes like, OECD released last year a global tax reporting framework for digital platforms in the sharing and gig economy. Since they also represent somehow a way to regulate diverse digital platforms, could you address a little bit on how OECD is internally addressing this multi-dimensional aspects of platform regulation? So that's the first question from Alexandre. And we have an additional question from IT for Change, saying, does the framework require non-OECD hosted platforms to participate voluntarily, but OECD hosted ones mandatorily? I think you have addressed part of this question previously. But the question asks as well, does this not change the way platforms would be experienced by non-OECD citizens? So those will be the two questions. One on a global tax reporting framework for digital platforms from OECD, and the other one from non-OECD hosted platforms, how they engage, how they participate in the whole framework. Okay.
Okay. All right. I'll do my best with these. We're starting to approach the edges of knowledge, even within OECD content, because the taxation materials come from a totally different directorate within the organization. But it's the work that the tax group is doing is, to me, very inspirational, and it's exactly the kind of thing the OECD should be doing. Is taking something that is really complicated and not working all that well because the regulations and laws are so fragmented, and trying to bring it all together in a centralized way that everybody can work with, and it is so much simpler, more efficient, and less expensive as a result, while at the same time being more effective. So I think the actual question was, how is the OECD internally addressing the multi-dimensional nature of platforms in these projects that we're working on? There are a lot of aspects to that question, which is a really good one. Let me start with what I know the best, and then see if that answer is good enough. So, in the work that we're doing on transparency reporting, we're of course well aware that companies like Google are very, very multi-dimensional. Google isn't just search and advertising. You know, it's a whole mess of things. It's it's YouTube, it's mobile phone software, it's gosh, they've got like blimps that provide high-speed internet service from like lower outer space. And they have so much going on, it's impossible to describe it. But and then you've got companies like Facebook. It's more than just a Facebook platform. It's Instagram and it's WhatsApp. So the way we're approaching this in the transparency work is to approach it one service at a time, which is to say that the transparency reports should be filled out at the service level, not at the company-wide level. So we would expect a different report to be filled out by Instagram versus the ones for WhatsApp and Facebook itself. And likewise for, say, Microsoft, which owns both LinkedIn and Skype, we would hope to have separate reports issued for each of those precisely because they are different. And it's less useful to have this information all lumped together. Now, how that bears on the tax work, I'm really reluctant to say because I'm not a tax expert. I can only imagine that, of course, the relevant tax rules are going to be different and applied differently to different types of businesses, even when those businesses are under the same corporate umbrella. Then the second question about whether the requirements of the VTRF will differ depending on where the platforms are coming from. No, they won't because it's all voluntary. So, and it's the same for, if you decide to use it, then the questions that you'll be asked will be the same questions that you would be asked no matter where you were located. And furthermore, the information that we compile from these completed templates and that we put into a database won't just be made available to OECD members. They'll be public. Anybody's going to be able to access this information. I think that's the plan, regardless of where they're coming from. I mean, that's the way transparency reporting is supposed to work. It's supposed to be transparent to everybody. We want everybody to be able to see this information, and in principle, at least the platforms themselves want everybody to see this information.
Thanks, Jeremy. We're approaching not only the borders of your knowledge into other areas of the organization, but almost approaching the borders of our time for this panel. But let me come back to you with a final a question. And that's an issue that bothers me a lot on the struggles on how to fight terrorism and extremist content online, which is there is some line of comparison between the terrorist attack on September 11 and the very unfortunate incident on Christchurch, which is the way in which the attacker ended up exploring the very design of the media that is being used at the time to gather more attention, to make sure that the attack is widely viewed worldwide. So if we look at September 11, you have the first plane crashing into the building, and then suddenly all TV cameras turning to the building to report on the incident. And then you have the second plane crashing into the building. Is almost like this sort of way to gather more media coverage, more global attention, to make sure that people will see the second airplane crashing into the building live on TV. At the time, there will be the vehicle, there will be the media that will gather the larger amount of attention possible. And when we turn into the Christchurch incident, there are some comparisons that could be made, because live streaming of videos It's something that in most platforms end up receiving more attention. The algorithm end up preferring that type of content, and in some platforms, even sending out notification to users saying, hey, this person is starting now a live streaming of something. Do you want to watch it? So in some cases, in the two incidents, there is a way in which the attacker end up exploring the attention that the specific media end up providing at the time, being either live TV broadcasting on the September 11 incident, or in the Christchurch attack, the way in which online platforms end up operating and how they treat live streaming as a preferred type of content. And the reason I'm asking you this is that when we look into the attack at the Capitol building in January 6th this year, we had two questions on the audience on the attack on the Capitol building. And that's specifically something that you can quite clearly see as something, as an incident that can lead violent extremist content that platforms would like to take down, that they should take down. But then my question would be, in those decades, engaging in this debate on how to better treat and how to better fight this type of content, what lessons we could take from the attack on the Capitol building early this year, and how the attack on the Capitol building in the US end up leading the conversation to some directions that might seem new or that might reinforce some directions that OECD might have explored in the past. So this is just react to two questions that we had on the audience on the Capitol building attack, and how this connect to the whole effort of fighting Tevec content online. Any big lessons, any new takeaways, especially considering online platforms? One of the questions mentioned here, the ban of specific political actors from one platform, and other platforms being more reluctant to ban specific political actors. So how do you react, and what will be the key takeaways that we could take out of this very unfortunate incident as well?
Right. Thank you for that fascinating question, Carlos. You are absolutely right to draw some parallels between September 11th and the Christchurch attack, for example. In both cases, the attackers intentionally designed things to go viral, or the equivalent of going viral back in 2001, when it was more the traditional media that was propagating the image or the images from that attack. But it was, I'm sure you remember what it was like. You just couldn't see anything else on television for days other than those planes flying into the towers over and over again. The Christchurch attacker, on the other hand, did not rely on traditional media at all, which has gotten very good, has always been very good, really, at screening out things like gun murders, but instead relied on this live streaming technology. And it wasn't just that he decided to have his cell phone, his mobile phone turned on, and to use the Facebook Live. It was much more sophisticated than that. There was already a plan in place to record that footage, with multiple other people involved, who very quickly recorded this footage and subtly altered that footage in many, many different ways on purpose, and then started uploading it to many other different platforms, including small ones, and medium and large ones. And the reason they subtly altered it was to try to defeat the automated software that would have been so effective at instantly removing these new uploads of that footage every time somebody did it, because it's very easy for the software to match these digital hashes, they're called, that are unique. They're like fingerprints for different images and different pieces of video. So they intentionally altered them in small ways that weren't large enough to change really what people saw, but in the eyes of the algorithms that search for this stuff, it was a big enough change. So it was much harder for it to pick it up. The lesson that I draw from this is we are in a constantly evolving battle here. It's an arms race, basically, where one side gets some new technology that's, say, more effective at detecting truly harmful content, and then the bad actors adjust and they figure out how to defeat that technology with something else. And then the platforms or governments will figure out how to address that new weapon that's being used. And as soon as they do that, the bad actors come up with some new innovation that they use. So we are the bad news, I think, is I will only speak for the OECD. We are already behind in this because we're focusing on the problem of content, and we're focusing on it because it hasn't been addressed in a way that makes sense yet, in our opinion. It's not that the platforms are doing a bad job. I just mean the transparency aspect of it from an international perspective, from our perspective as a body that has member countries, and we try to come up with sensible solutions and advice. We think that this transparency regulation that's coming forward could be managed in a better way. But it is aimed at content. And what we're starting to hear from experts is content is not the right way to look at this problem, because the bad guys have moved on already. They've already figured out how to defeat methods that are aimed at taking action on content, because they've just gotten so smart at it. And I won't take the time to explain. I know we're out of time. But that's basically a big lesson. This is an ongoing war. The good guys are behind for the most part, but we're catching up. And the platforms are putting more and more resources into this and getting better at it too. But it's a really, really difficult problem. And we're going to run into the same thing with respect to other types of harmful content as well. So this is going to be with us for quite some time.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I think that's the kind of message that we are looking for here. And I think that you brilliantly communicated on how difficult it is to fight Tevec online, and the struggles that we face right now. Sometimes they go way beyond content, and platforms are more and more trying to focus on behavior, coordinated behavior for illicit, illegal actions as well. So definitely we have a lot of other topics to cover under this conversation, but I could not thank you enough for taking your time to stay with us and to answer in details the questions that we received from the audience. So on behalf of the audience, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for your answers. And I will turn now back to Henrique from the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee for the for the final words. But as a moderator, since my job is done, I just have to personally thank you, Jeremy. That was super insightful, and I'm pretty sure that the messages that you deliver in this panel will definitely be heard, will definitely be taken into account by policymakers, by regulators, and by all of us that end up engaging and have a really passionate interest on those topics. So thank you again, and then Henrique, back to you.
Muito obrigado, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, and Carlos Affonso. Indeed, that was an excellent panel. I was highly impressed with the practical perspective that OECD is taking towards this very important topic. Let me remind you that we are going to have another meeting on the 27th at 11 a.m. and another one at 2 p.m. So please join us next Thursday, and let me thank you for your participation, especially Jeremy West. Wish you all a very nice day, and thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.